It is my pleasure to bring up our preacher this Sunday. Rudy Carrasco is a 30-year veteran of faith-based nonprofit and community service. Prior to joining the Murdoch Trust as a program director, Rudy has served as the U.S. regional facilitator for Partners Worldwide. And if you're not familiar with what they are a network of Christian businesses using business to end poverty. Rudy is a widely published writer and speaker, and we're so excited to have him with us this Sunday. He and his wife have mentioned how they go where God has led them around the country, so we are so pleased that the two of them, Rudy and Coffee, as well as their family, have found a home here at Village. So we are so proud and excited to bring up Rudy Carrasco.
We see the first slide. I want to begin by reading again the Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither sleep nor slumber. The Lord watches over you, and the Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. W. Dennis Tucker Jr. is a professor at Truett Seminary at Baylor University, and he had some comments about this psalm that were helpful in the NIV application commentary series put out by Zondervan Academic Press. So there were a few notes that I thought were illuminating. One is that Psalm 121 is classified as a psalm of confidence, and it's meant to celebrate God's providential care. It's also the second psalm in the Songs of Ascent, which begin with Psalm 120. This theme of confidence in God is carried through 4 strophes, or stanzas. There are 4 stanzas, and they use a poetic technique frequently employed in the Songs of Ascent. And here you go, a vocabulary word for your next spelling bee. Okay, this technique is called anadiplosis. Anadiplosis. So anadiplosis is a technique that occurs when a word or a phrase at the end of one line is picked up and used in the following line, and often near the front of the following line. So some interpreters refer to this literary device as a stair-step technique, the vocabulary connecting each line as the reader moves through the psalm. Now, the Songs of Ascent as a whole, including Psalm 121, are pilgrimage songs, and they were likely sung by God's people on their way to Jerusalem. So maybe you've been on a road trip and traveling together and with your group, and you're singing songs together on the road trip. So it's helpful to put this psalm into that type of context. Psalm 121 makes claims about God, the people, and the world in which they live, and invites people to consider the source of their help. Now, a bit of a closer look. Back in verse 1, the slide on verse 1. Now, in Hebrew, the action of lifting up your eyes implies that you are longing or desiring something. So the reference to Zion, I lift my eyes to the mountains, is a typical reference to Zion, which is the Hebrews considered the mountain of God. I'm looking up and desiring for God. And the term help is not merely help in terms of assistance, but it's a bit stronger. It refers to God's protection. So not just coming along to help you a little bit with a smaller task, but a larger form of help. In verses 4 and 5, next slide there. So 4 references watching, and then go to 5 now. And then 5 also references the Lord watching over. Now, this watching over is an active watching. It describes later that he'll not let your foot slip, and that God neither sleeps nor slumbers. So here's a note about sleeping. And again, drawing from the theologian, Tucker, who's at the seminary. Truett Seminary is connected to Baylor University. It's really interesting. So one thing that's great about being able to preach and teach the Word of God is this. There's a phrase in Mexico, enseñar es aprender dos veces. Teaching is learning 2 times. Because, you studied it and you know it for yourself, but if you're going to turn around and teach it to others, you got to study it again and make sure, you've got it down. So I love any opportunity. If the 3rd graders need a speaker, Renji, I don't need the big leadership audience. I'll talk to the 3rd graders. So it was a great chance to look a little bit deeper into the background of this psalm. And so Tucker writes this about sleeping and gods. He says, within the larger ancient Near East tradition, the gods were frequently depicted as sleeping. So not Israel, not Yahweh, but other gods of other nations. This activity on the part of the deities was not considered exceptional or unusual, but simply necessary. Even as humans need sleep to perform their daily activities, so too do the deities, these other peoples considered. In the Atrahasis epic from approximately 1880 BC, the god Enlil is awakened from his restful slumber by the humans. And he demands that they be cut off from food as punishment for waking him up. In another source, in the Enuma Elish, the god Apsu also complains about his lack of sleep because of the noise made by his offspring. Neither text records outrage or shock that the deity was asleep, only that the sleeping deity had been disturbed. Now, in contrast, Yahweh, the God of Israel, our God, neither sleeps nor slumbers, but rather remains on watch, protecting his people. Now, in verse 5, we're told that the Lord is our shade. Now, this verse combines 2 concepts of shade and the right hand. So theologian Tucker goes on to explain that because a soldier carries his shield in his left hand, the right side of his body remains exposed and vulnerable. So consequently, a soldier always sought to have a friend or an ally at his right hand to provide protection. And the idea here is that Yahweh, our God, is that right hand of protection. And at the same time, Yahweh is our shade. Frequently, individuals are invited into the shadow of the wings of Yahweh, and in the shade, the psalmists find relief from the forces that threaten them. As shade, Yahweh will protect the psalmist from the searing heat of the sun by day and the dangers of the moon by night. Now, the reference to moon is interesting because some scholars think that may have been a reference to a Babylonian god. There was a Babylonian moon god named Sin. I think it's pronounced Sin. And this Babylonian god was thought to cause a lot of illnesses. So, not certain about that, but that's what some scholars have conjectured. So the Lord He's at our right hand, and He's our shade. And the psalm closes saying that He will, this is a way to say the totality of our lives, coming and going, now and forevermore. God has a total watch over us. Now, Some theologians describe Psalm 121 as a psalm for sojourners and refugees. Another commentator, Jeremy Bauma, has this to say about that concept, that amid a threatening and hostile world, having a God who desires to help, but whose power is not sufficient, provides little hope. Conversely, a God who stands over all as creator, yet fails to intervene personally, remains equally problematic. The psalmist rejects what is sometimes labeled as a false dilemma in logic, that there are only two solutions to a problem. Instead, the psalmist provides a third way that offers a much more powerful affirmation about the God of Israel. The God who will deliver the psalmist is the God who stands over all creation as its maker, and the God of all power who seeks to intervene. He seeks to intervene in the life of the psalmist to ensure that not even his foot will slip. Those who journey in this world are assured that God journeys with them and helps them as the one who stands over all of creation, as our maker, who today seeks to intervene. So when I read Psalm 121, I hear the voice of my mentor, who used to repeat this verse constantly. His name's Dr. John Perkins, and he's 89 years old, 89 years young. Amen? And right out of college, I went to work for him. For 4 years, I was his assistant. I sat in his office. We didn't have a door or any barriers. I would hear all of his phone calls. And I traveled with him. First year, I traveled with him 11 times, once a month about, to spots all over the country. And he would read this in a King James. So I actually, when I was talking to Ken about Psalm 121, and I immediately heard the opening of Psalm 121 in the King James. I looketh unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. I'm like, whence? We don't really use that, right? But from whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And that is meaningful to him because in his life, God has protected him for 89 years. He came, he himself fits that sojourner refugee category. His story, in a certain niche of the church in America, in terms of urban ministry, in terms of racial reconciliation, Perkins is really well known. He's got about 10 or 12 books. The various universities and seminaries in this area invite him in on a regular basis. You may have heard him or seen him at some point. His story is that he left Mississippi when he was about 15 years old and vowed never to return because of the very difficult, oppressive conditions. And the instigating event was that his cousin, who had served in the U.S. military in World War II, came back, was shot and killed in a racial incident by law enforcement. Nothing ever happened. There was no justice brought about the situation. And Perkins said, you know what? I'm out of here. I'm leaving and I'm not coming back. And he moved to California, ended up in Monrovia, and he was not a Christian at that time because all this time, he said, and he's written about this in his books, he said, you know what? Everybody in the South is a Christian, and yet look at the system, the Jim Crow system. Christianity doesn't seem to have any impact. So he decided that he wasn't going to be a Christian. He moved to California to make a new life. Is a war veteran from the Korean War, became a Christian in 1957. A Christian businessman led him in discipleship after his son had gone to a Good News Bible Club. His son came home from a Good News Bible Club, talking about Jesus and Christianity. And, John Perkins was like, that's not really what we're trying to be about. But he saw transformation in the life of his son. He was discipled, and in 1960, he felt God saying to him, go back. Go back to Mississippi. You don't want to go there. You don't want to be there, but that's kind of the reason I need people there to help do the work that I want done. So he's kind of a sojourner two times. One, he fled and left Mississippi, and then he returned back to a very difficult situation. He planted churches, and in the midst of planting churches, he saw the great needs that the people had, and he said, we've got to do more. And when you look in the Gospels, Luke, and across the Gospels, you'll see Jesus preaching the word, calling people to repent and come back to God, and then healing people and addressing some of their immediate needs. So Perkins went back and began that work. In 1970, he himself was a victim. Sheriffs in a small town grabbed him and two others, had him for 24 hours, and beat him severely. And this is documented in his books as well as some video news reports. And it was a very interesting story because he spends about 9 months in and out of the hospital. And even to this day, he had to have stomach surgery, and his stomach is actually smaller than our stomachs, and he still can't eat a lot of different types of food. So I would travel with him, and we'd end up at a Wendy's. And even people were ready to take him out to a nice restaurant, and we'd end up at Wendy's because he'd buy the little bowl of chili, just to kind of be able to take in some food and keep it even. But he was in that hospital bed. In his second book, he describes this. And, if you think of anybody who would have reason to not love their neighbor, here you were beaten and victimized by others, a black man being treated this way by white officials. You would think, well, that guy kind of has a reason. But he came out of that experience with a completely different view of racial reconciliation. And this is why. He said he understood that blacks were suffering under the system. But he hadn't really quite understood how others, particularly white folks in the South, were also being dehumanized by the system. He tells a very interesting story. He's laying in bed, and he's thinking about that experience in the jail, being beaten by the sheriff. And he said he stops and he freeze frames the face of the sheriff, the main sheriff who was beating him. And that person's face was contorted and angry, but he stopped, and in his mind, he's just looking at this person, and he says, look, this entire system that this man's upholding is distorting the image of God in him. It's dehumanizing him. John Perkins, a victim, laying in bed, suffering, is having compassion on the people who were hurting him. In later years, I became very close to his son, Derek. His son tells me that when integration came in the town, that their high school was integrated, now black and white boys are playing football together, and there were friendships forming, and one day, one of his white friends from the football team was on the black side of town with Derek and his friends, and they were friends. And that young man's father, who was a police officer, came over, grabbed his own son, started beating him, and threw him in the car and drove off. The next day, Derek says, they saw this friend at high school, and the friend had been beaten up, had marks and bruises all over his face. And the friend came up to Derek. This young white man comes up to this young black man, and he looks at him, and he says, look at me. I'm not my dad. I'm not like that. We're friends. So even this entire system was hurting and distorting, it turns out, everybody. So I'm grateful among many that John Perkins did what? Took a step of obedience as a sojourner to go back to a place he didn't really want to go to. And now I think I see why this Psalm 121, is constantly on his lips. I look to the mountains. From where comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Now, this psalm is meaningful to me personally as well. Next slide. Okay. So who's that? And how old am I? I haven't heard it yet. You're so close. 8. I'm 8 years old. That was the cool shirt. I love that shirt. That's awesome. That's me as an 8-year-old. My mother died when I was 6. And our father was not involved. My sister, who was 20 years old at the time, took legal custody of me. And she was a sophomore in college. If you attended college and if you were in your sophomore year, and if you can remember back to what you were thinking about, or at the age of 20, she had some kids to raise, my siblings as well. And she's alone. My mother had come up out of central Mexico, Aguascalientes, and people didn't move around as much like they do now. We were here, and we didn't have any family. She was ready to drop out of school. She didn't do it. The judge told her. He said, you know what? If you're going to take care of these kids, you're going to really need to do everything you can to prepare yourself. So she arranged for family friends to care for us for a few years until her graduation day. So on her graduation day, people line up, right, when they're about to call your name. And so she looks out in the audience, and there's her siblings. I had a suitcase with me. And she had bought a house about a month before. She'd been recruited. She was at Occidental College, did a math undergrad, bought a house, had a job with Occidental Petroleum coming out. So I had a mortgage, had a full-time job, and 3 kids to raise, and she's alone. So she called the suicide hotline. It was a Christian group. They talked to her about Jesus for 45 minutes. And they wouldn't let her off the phone. They said, you know what? Promise me you're going to go to church this Sunday. Who do you know? I don't know anybody who goes to church. Do you go to church? No. Well, think of somebody. They're on the phone. She's, my freshman year roommate, she used to go to church a lot. Okay. Will you find her and go to church? Do you promise? Yes. So she finds Sue Salibian, and that Sunday goes to Valley Baptist Church on Alameda Boulevard in Burbank, California, a conservative Baptist Association member church. And during the altar call, I think they sang Just As I Am 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And here she stands up and comes down to the altar and says, I want to give my life to Christ. And they turn around and they announce it to the church, and they invite a deacon over. The deacon's going to pray for you and take your info. I always imagine, I have no basis for what I'm about to tell you, but I always imagine that it was that deacon's first Sunday. First Sunday, like doing this whole pray with people. Because, maybe not. Maybe they're an experienced hand. That deacon heard a story. So later on in the New Testament, Paul will talk about being adopted into the family of God, spiritually. Well, my family needed spiritual and literal adoption into a family. So that poor deacon heard a story of a woman who is committed and doesn't know where to turn and has a huge task in front of her. So in those years, we were in church. I was one of those kids in church four days out of the week. Wednesday night, Awana. Friday night, if there's a youth program. Sunday, both morning and evening services. And if there were, sometimes on Saturday morning, somebody would come around and grab the youth and try to put us to work, mowing lawns and cleaning things. Just a lot of activities for young people. And I soaked in so much scripture in those years. I would sit in the back. But Pastor usually he had a text that Sunday, but kind of tried to defend it from all 66 books of the Bible. So talk about, this is a church where you heard a lot of rustling. And even when I was bored or didn't feel like listening, my only alternatives were listen to the sermon or grab a Bible in the pew and start reading. So I was a young guy reading Jeremiah, Ezekiel, tried to get through Leviticus as well as the Gospels. Revelation was exciting, right, and dramatic. And I read a proverb, 22:29. Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will serve before kings. He will not serve obscure men. I read that, and just like we know that we're going to eat lunch around midday today, or that you're going to drive away and go home, I knew that one day I would work at the White House. I mean, at that point, I was about 10 or 11, and I said, well, we don't have a king. We're the United States. What do we have? We have a president. Oh. You know, I mean, one of the great things about the scripture and people is that by faith, you'll read stuff and just believe it, right? You know, and it didn't have to be the White House, but that's what just came to my mind. Slide. So someone speak up and tell me what's happening in this photo. That's George Bush. And who's the guy to his left? This is 4 months before 9/11. It's May of 2001. And President Bush had been in office for 4 months. He took office in January of 2001. His first item on his agenda was an education bill, which they passed. And the second domestic item was a bill to address discrimination against faith-based groups throughout the federal government. And the process for getting legislation passed is, you're talking not just to the House and the Senate, but you're talking to constituent groups. They invited a group of Hispanic Christian leaders from across the country to meet with the president, and I learned later how the process works. I'm not from a political background, so I was like, what does a meeting like that do to help, get legislation passed? Like I said, I learned later. At the time, I just thought, hey, I was invited, first of all, to a broader meeting of Hispanic Christian leaders at this time, and they said that, hey, we're trying to get about 50 people from across the country, and we'll just do like a meeting in the press briefing room and have a big photo op or something. I was just happy to be invited, like in the NBA. I always make a joke in the NBA that one team is the champion team and the other team is just happy to be there, and they're going to lose quickly, right? Because they're not even prepared. They're just glad to be in the room. I was just glad to be invited. I knew a woman who was in the faith-based office, and had actually done a little bit of volunteer help for her, and somehow ended up on the list. And I wasn't born yesterday, so I wasn't. If it was an accident that I was on the list, I wasn't going to give any indication. I just shut my mouth and said, "Sure, I'll be there." Well, on the day that happened, that was, I think, early May, instead of 50 people, they got 120 Hispanic Christian leaders. And so the whole meeting changed, and they said, well, we're going to get a group of 10 into the room, and then the rest of the group will do a larger group photo op or something. Again, I'm just glad to be there. I flew with a buddy all night. We almost got stuck in Las Vegas airport. America West pulled a plane that was going to Phoenix, pulled it back to the terminal, loaded up the D.C. people, because you don't want a bunch of Washington, D.C. people in your airport all night. So we get there. We're at that St. John's Church that's across the lawn from the White House. And it was nice. I was running an urban ministry at the time. I also had a newspaper column on the side. So I thought, hey, I'll write about this. And I wasn't all the way sure that I was supportive, by the way. I was mostly supportive of this idea, but faith in politics is always a big question. We're in line for the food, and my buddy says, they're waiting for you. Who's waiting for you? The group. You're on the list. What list? The list. You're on the list. What list? The list! I'm like, oh, this is just a bunch of guys who don't know nothing. And I said, okay, well. And they said, we can't find the list. They're waiting for you. So there's 10 of us going across. And so it turned out what happened was they said, let's have a smaller meeting. Leaders can raise their issues and concerns and then move along to a photo op. So when I got into the room there and I saw my name card next to the president, I looked at my friend, Lisa Trevino. She'd come out of Texas, and she looked at me and gave me a wink. I thought that I represented you. No one ever told me why I was in there, and I wasn't going to ask. I was, hey, I'm there. I think I should be there. I said, do I represent youth? Like a year later, I asked her. I was there because I was the only one without gray hair, right? She said, no, you're actually a newspaper columnist. You've written for Christianity Today. You're one of the few Latino Christian leaders in the country who actually writes in the public space. We thought it would be valuable to have you at the table. So a year later, I actually had a job offer from the White House faith-based office. And my wife and I sort of looked at each other for 24 hours and said, wow, but we didn't feel called to leave the ministry we were leading. Now, I don't know, I won't get an explanation until heaven, but how does it happen that I was 10 or 11 years old and had a certainty that one day I would work at the White House? I have no idea, but that's what happened. That was a piece of the protection, because in order to get there, my sister is taking us to church, is raising us, and providing enough shade so that I could develop and achieve. And that church, sometimes we send kids to church, to summer camp, and maybe an offering is taken to help some kids that need financial help. From that conservative Baptist church, I had a lot of help getting off to these wonderful camps up in the mountains of Southern California. So the entire church, as well as my sister and my family, came around. And that is something that God did. Next slide. God provided for my family while my son fought cancer. In 2004, he was diagnosed with leukemia. And there he is, and there's our number 2 child. Micah was born at that point. My son's name is Sam. And that was a journey, but we saw God's provision. Health insurance, thank God we had health insurance. The community of people who came around us. And a number of people that we know who are not Christ followers saw so many Christians that they didn't know who were coming to love us and support us, and they said, what is this? It was such a strong witness to Christ, the way that we were cared for in that time. Next slide. Oh, the next slide. Oh, it's not. So there's two more great slides that aren't going to pop up. But one of them is a shot of my son when he's 9, and he had just finished cancer treatment. And then a shot of him last year at age 18, starting at Calvin University. And he's about a few inches taller than me, so he's healthy. I know the stories don't always turn out like that, but I'm grateful for the provision that God gave us. And then finally, my last slide. So my kids are in the front, you're spared. Oh, there we go. Actually, can you go back to the one before? Okay, there we are. So on the left side, that's us in 2009 in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. I had a work trip. He's 9 years old there and had just finished cancer treatment. And then there on the right, that's last year at this time, he was starting college. So I'm grateful for his life, and at some point you'll see him around here at Village. And next slide. So it was not inevitable. It wasn't promised that Sam would live and beat cancer, but he did. And he is a wonderful and awesome big brother to Micah and Isabella and Gabrielle. And final slide. You know, all of us are in need of help and protection. We pray, especially around needs that we have or that our businesses, our institutions. But I want to leave you with a question for yourself. When you look back on your own life, your own story, how has God watched over you? How has God helped you? How has God been your shade? How has God been at your right hand? How has God not allowed your foot to slip? When we make petitions, when we ask things of God, when we call out and cry out, it's a good practice to first worship and give thanks. That's throughout the Old Testament. So many pieces of the Old Testament start with recitations of Israel's history and the way God has delivered them. It applies as well in our own stories. How has God watched over you? Thank you.